One black Mercedes had to buy 102 lives. That is the decision at Entebbe. In the next few minutes, you will see why Israeli commandos trusted a cheap imitation of Idi Amin's motorcade, why that disguise was already wrong before the wheels touched Uganda, and how intelligence mattered more than bravado. If you had 10 seconds and one bad disguise, would you still go? The sound comes first, the low, chest-deep growl of a C-130 Hercules in the dark. Then heat. African runaway heat rising through the open ramp at night. This still matters because modern operations fail the same way old ones did. Not only from lack of courage, but from one bad assumption, one imperfect detail, 1 second lost before the shooting starts. Air France Flight 139 was hijacked on 27 June 1976 by 2 members of PFLP-External Operations and 2 German militants from revolutionary cells. The aircraft went first to Benghazi, then to Entebbe. This is the promise paid early, that Mercedes was never the plan by itself. It was only the outer skin. The real weapon was intelligence precise enough to tell men where to drive, which building to hit, and where hostages were likely lying on a dirty terminal floor under white lights. You can smell the fuel trapped in the cabin air. You can hear children trying not to cry. The stakes are not abstract. They rarely are. Many missions still turn on the same question. How do you move fast when the first picture you built may already be wrong? By the time Flight 139 reached Uganda, distance had become part of the weapon. Entebbe was more than 4,000 kilometers from Israel. That matters. Rescue by force began to look impossible before anyone even spoke of commandos. Inside the aircraft and later the old terminal, isolation thickened. The air was stale. Sweat dried and returned. Boots struck the floor with the hard, flat sound of armed men who knew nobody was coming soon. Some hostages were released. Israeli and Jewish passengers were kept back. That separation was not only tactical, it was a message. You are now bargaining material. And here is the first restrained turn. But distance was not the hardest part. Not yet. The harder part was this. Uganda was not neutral ground. It had an owner, and he liked being seen. Entebbe was dangerous because the hijackers were not alone with their captives. They sat inside the power of Idi Amin. Ugandan soldiers were present. Guard towers watched the runway. The old terminal stood in hostile territory, not in a sealed room waiting to be breached. Outside, the night air was wet and heavy. Insects scraped at the dark around the floodlights. Inside, silence compressed itself between bursts of movement and orders. Israel could negotiate, but time was thinning. Every extra day increased the chance of execution, dispersal, or political collapse. Here, the operation stopped being a simple rescue fantasy. It became an intelligence problem first. How do you strike deep into a state that may greet your arrival with uniforms, rifles, and official permission to kill you? The raid lived because details survived. Released hostages described the terminal, the gunmen, the rhythms of the room. Israeli planners also used construction knowledge from people familiar with parts of Entebbe's layout. Papers spread under yellow light. Fingers traced doors and angles. Coffee went cold in cups nobody finished. This is where the hook is answered plainly. The Mercedes could only matter because men already knew where it had to stop and what had to happen next. Without that, it was theater rolling into gunfire. How much would you trust a plan built from memory? Dan Shamron and others had to trust exactly that. And another turn signal comes here. The disguise sounds bold in hindsight. In real time, it was almost embarrassingly fragile. A bluff depends on the other side not looking too closely. Sayeret Matkal would lead the assault. Dan Shomron shaped the broader operation. Yoni Netanyahu commanded the lead element on the ground. The aircraft were C-130 Hercules transports, flying long and low to avoid attention. The plan was simple only on paper. Land at night, unload a black Mercedes and Land Rovers, imitate Idi Amin's convoy for a few seconds, close the distance, then strike. But the cold detail remains. Amin was often using a white Mercedes by then, not black. One layer of deception was already outdated. You can hear the landing gear thump. You can smell hot oil and metal in the cargo bay. One painted surface, one wrong memory. Whole operations have died from less. This one moved anyway, because there was no cleaner option left. Now, the film-like moment people remember. The Hercules touches down. Metal shudders through the fuselage. The rear ramp lowers with a heavy mechanical groan. Night air rushes in, hot and dusty, carrying the smell of runway rubber and fuel. The black Mercedes rolls first. Land Rovers follow, headlights low. Men inside know the trick has a narrow purpose, not to fool the whole base, only to steal a few breaths of confusion. This is the point where deception becomes movement. Nothing abstract remains. Tires hit tarmac. Doors stay shut. Engines idle with the subdued tremor of something pretending to belong. A good deception operation often looks effortless after the fact. It rarely feels that way from inside the vehicle. It feels thin, it feels borrowed, it feels like time cracking beneath you. The first weakness appeared almost at once. Accounts differ in detail, but the broad picture is hard to escape. The approach did not stay clean. The force had intended to neutralize Ugandan sentries quietly, if possible, and preserve surprise a little longer. Instead, the silence tore early. Suppressed gunfire is not silent. It snaps, then hangs. A shouted warning can travel farther than a bullet. Soles slapped concrete. Someone understood too late. Someone else understood fast. Do you keep pretending after the first shot, or do you run the rest of the plan at full speed? There was no time for debate. That is the hidden cruelty of deception in war. Once it breaks, it does not politely fade. It collapses, and everyone inside the plan must immediately become something else. Faster, louder, more direct. This is where the legend needs trimming. Entebbe was not a flawless machine unfolding step by step. It was control wrestled out of a plan that had already started fraying. Dan Shamron later described the importance of preserving surprise. But surprise is not a switch. It leaks, it degrades, it buys less with every second. You can imagine the sound inside an earpiece then. Radio hiss, clipped words, breathing too close to the microphone. Hands tightened on weapons slick with sweat. Yoni Netanyahu's men were now racing not to execute a perfect deception, but to outrun the failure of one. Why did speed matter more than stealth now? Because every surviving second before the hijackers reacted inside the terminal was worth more than the disguise had ever been. The bluff was over. The old terminal was the most dangerous room in the operation. Hostages and hijackers occupied the same tight space. Commandos burst in shouting in Hebrew and English, ordering everyone down. Under fluorescent light, confusion can be fatal. Not everyone understands at once. Not everyone hears the same words. Some people stand because they think standing will save them. Others move because staying still feels impossible. The air smelled of old sweat, dust, and fear held too long indoors. Bags spilled, voices stacked on top of each other. Here, rescue and massacre were separated by fractions of a second, and by identification under pressure. It is easy to admire decisive action from a distance. It is harder to sit with what that action demands up close. Shooting accurately in a room where the wrong silhouette costs a civilian life. The assault inside the terminal was fast, but not bloodless. The hijackers were killed. Many hostages survived because the gunmen were reached before they could organize a mass killing. Yet not everyone made it out. Some hostages died during the raid. One was Jean-Jacques Maimoni. Another was Ida Borishevich. A third, Dora Bloch, had been taken earlier to a hospital in Kampala and was later murdered by Ugandan officers. These names matter because success can become too smooth in retelling. It was not smooth to those who bled on that floor or vanished into custody after the headlines moved on. The terminal still held the smell of cordite and burst concrete. Survival was real, so was the cost. A rescue can be extraordinary and still leave a ledger of the dead behind it. Yoni Netanyahu, commander of the assault element, was killed during the operation. His death fixed itself into the memory of the raid because it arrived inside success, not after failure. That is harder to absorb. You hear the operation described as daring, and it was. You hear it described as brilliantly planned, and much of it was. Then one shot cuts through the myth. Sharp, final. A leader goes down while the mission still moves. Men keep running because they must. There is a severe kind of dark satisfaction in deception succeeding against the odds, But war does not let that satisfaction remain clean for long. The operation later took his name in Israel, Operation Yonatan. Memory often does that. It takes a complex event and pins it to one death, so the rest can be carried at all. Getting in was only half the problem. Getting out meant loading wounded, moving hostages, securing the runway, and leaving before Ugandan resistance hardened. Israeli forces also destroyed Ugandan MiG fighters on the ground to reduce the danger of pursuit after takeoff. Firelight flickered on the tarmac. Engines roared louder now. The night that had hidden them was becoming visible with every shot and every minute. You can feel the pressure shift here. The deception phase is gone. The rescue phase is ending. What remains is extraction, the least glamorous part, and often the one that fails. But the aircraft lifted. They carried out most of the hostages and their own wounded. By then, the operation had become what many real raids become in the end. Not elegant, not clean, but just fast enough. So, what did Entebbe actually prove? Not that boldness alone can rescue the trapped. Not that a clever prop can overpower geography. It proved something colder. Intelligence gives deception its bones. Deception gives speed its opening. And once the disguise cracks, discipline must carry what theater can no longer hold. That is the lesson people still miss when they retell the black Mercedes as if it were magic. It was not magic. It was a few seconds purchased by research, rehearsal, and men willing to continue after the first imperfection became obvious. You can compare that to other famous wartime deceits, even Operation Mincemeat in 1943. The file, the body, the forged life. Different scale, same truth. The lie only works because someone studied exactly what the other side was ready to believe. The record keeps this. 27 June 1976, Air France Flight 139 was hijacked. The record keeps this. More than 4,000 kilometers separated Israel from Entebbe. The record keeps this. About 102 hostages were rescued in the raid. What no record keeps, whose mouth had gone dry inside that black Mercedes before the ramp dropped. What no record keeps, which hostage decided in 1 second under white light to lie still instead of standing up. Numbers matter. Dates matter. Unit names matter. Sayeret Matkal, C-130 Hercules, Operation Yonatan. But records have edges. They can count sorties, rounds, distances, bodies. They cannot fully count the private weight of choosing speed over certainty or of trusting a deception already beginning to fail. That part is carried in memory, not paperwork. One black Mercedes had to buy 102 lives. It did not save them by elegance. It saved time by existing at the right distance, at the right hour, inside a plan strong enough to survive its own first failure. That is why Entebbe endures. Not because deception was perfect, but because it was imperfect and used anyway. The engine noise, the hot runway air, the split-second confusion at the gate, those were not cinematic details added later. They were the operation. And they still ask something uncomfortable of you. If you had 10 seconds, one bad disguise, and people waiting behind you in the dark, would you keep the bluff alive for one more breath, or abandon it and run? Tell me which choice you think you could actually make when the ramp drops and the heat hits your face.